All right, welcome back. Okay, our next panel is about resiliency, which obviously is front and center with what we're dealing with outside. Thanks to the support and hard work and the vision of everybody in this room, New York is clearly the leader for all electric buildings now. Let's give ourselves a round of applause for that. First in 2021 with the passage of Local Law 154 here in New York City, which I'm very proud to say is based on the recommendation provided by Urban Green. Then last month, we were speaking with Doreen when New York State became the first state in the nation to require all electric new construction. It's very, very clear that the future of buildings is all electric. So our next panel is going to dive into the resiliency aspects of buildings of the future. And we've got a great moderator, Susanne DesRoches. Susanne is Vice President for Clean and Resilient Buildings at NYSERDA, and she is an Urban Green Board member. So Susanne, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, John. Great to see you all. I'm thrilled that this conference includes a whole panel on resiliency. I know Urban Green, since back in the post-Sandy days, has done work on resiliency. Certainly lots of efforts post-Sandy in the city, but as we really start to see decarbonized buildings move front and center, it's imperative that we include resiliency as we're making this transition, right? So we're about to make this a massive investment in decarbonization. We have targets by 2050 that require just a sea change in the buildings around us. And if we miss the opportunity to make those buildings last for 100 years, as we heard in the last panel, let's design those buildings for 100 years. I was like, great, let's make sure we're designing them for the climate that we will be living in 100 years, right? So this panel is going to dive into a bunch of different issues. Certainly we are going to touch on what's happening with electric buildings and resiliency, but we have to think about resiliency in a broader perspective. I've been working in this space for a long time. I'll tell you that smoke from wildfires was not a risk that we really thought was something that we should be designing for. Right? How many people in this room have designed a building in New York City with that in mind? I'd say very few, if any. Right? So we went from 2 years of trying to get as much outside air in as possible to overnight needing to keep that outside air out, and we laugh, right? But like these drastic changes, whether it's a day full of wildfire smoke or it's a 60-degree day in February followed by a minus 10-degree day, that's what we're looking at. It isn't necessarily just one storm, a rain event. It's this like variability. It's this sort of uncertainty to how we design and operate and exist in these spaces that we're really going to need to think about now as we're decarbonizing. So it isn't, are you doing adaptation versus decarb? Are you a greenhouse gas mitigation person first? Like, I love the sign, right? It's building solutions for climate change. There isn't two sides of this coin. We're talking about the same thing. And if we're not really intentional starting today or having started, frankly, 10 years ago, doing this work where as soon as we're thinking about building anything new renovation, upgrades, it all has to be designed for the future climate that we're, frankly, it's no longer the future, right? We used to call it, future weather when I worked at a previous agency. Now it's just, this is it, right? We're starting to live it. And unfortunately, it is quite variable. And it's not going to be what you're used to designing to and used to having these sort of historical norms. So that's my setup, a lot to talk about, but really it's a great opportunity. We're about to invest all of this money, so let's just make sure we do it the right way. So to start us off is Erika Jozwiak. She is at New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. She's a senior program manager. She leads infrastructure resiliency and the city's resilient design guidelines. So, Erika.
All right. Thanks so much, Susanne, and thank you for having me. So like I said, and thanks for the intro, my name is Erika Jozwiak. I work as a senior program manager at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. And before I go into this presentation, can I get a quick show of hands of who here is familiar with these guidelines, have heard of them before, and maybe has used them? Oh my gosh, great! Okay, this is actually super encouraging. I think that's a real great direction for the industry to be going. I see like a pretty good show of hands. So I won't get so into the 101, but I will give a little bit of an overview for those who might not be super familiar. I think these guidelines are a real representation of how to incorporate the resiliency and sustainability and environmental justice as well into the way that we design buildings and infrastructure today. So as Susanne said, we do need to be thinking in terms of climate change and how we're building, both in the sense of these larger events. So how do we make sure that our critical systems, our critical buildings and infrastructure are operational during an emergency scenario like a hurricane, a cloudburst event, and a heat wave, but also in these changing of chronic conditions. These are going to be a wide range of variability, but it is a changing of our baseline. This baseline will need to kind of be able to accommodate wider swings in temperature, frequent tidal floods, groundwater rise in the future. And so our baseline, the way that we design our buildings for now and for the future, needs to be slightly different than the decisions that we made in the past. And I think we need, when we're talking about resiliency, we also need to root this in a multi-hazard approach. We're moving away from this as an industry, I have seen, but in the past, I think when we talk about climate change, it's maybe with that top of mind of a hurricane or sea level rise events. But we really, in New York, we have a wide variety of climate risks and only kind of growing, as we have seen today in the past couple of days. And we need to be thinking about this all in tandem. So you can see here we have our 4 kind of key climate hazards that we developed with the New York City Panel on Climate Change using localized climate projections, all showing this increasing severity and frequency of these larger types of storm events and then these changing of chronic conditions. And today I'll be focusing mainly on the climate resiliency design guidelines portion of it, but just to plug, the city did release Plan NYC in April of this year. That is a kind of roadmap for how the city is going to be leading by example towards sustainable, resilient, and environmentally just goals for New York City overall. So the guidelines, I think, are our foray into incorporating climate change into all of the types of design that New York City does. This document uses climate change data, translates those projections that have an inherent bit of uncertainty to them into design guidance that engineers, architects, project managers can use to incorporate into their projects today. The reason why we need a guidance document here is because there is that kind of intrinsic uncertainty when we look into the future, and we do need to accept a certain level of risk whenever we are designing for buildings now. We also want to be consistent with our use of climate data. We want everyone to be kind of thinking about the standards in the same way, and so we can have a consistent risk reduction approach across all the different types of assets that the city currently owns and operates. So that includes building, infrastructure, and landscapes. This document is applicable to New York City capital projects today, but we are hoping to lead by example and expand this into the future. And it addresses these multiple hazards that we were talking about before on the previous slide. A couple of key features of the guidelines that allow it to preserve this flexibility are, it's not a prescriptive document. The guidelines address changes in heat, rainfall, and sea level, but allows the individual project manager to make decisions about what's most appropriate for the site. So this is really going to be site-specific resilient design. It's intended to make the existing scope of your project more resilient and give you the tools that you need to make these design decisions so that they're smart, so that your investment is lasting as long as it's intended to, and that you have the right set of tools to reduce the risk that your building or your site is exposed to. So a couple of examples here, maybe heat is a good one to start with, is if your building is going to be exposed to extreme heat in the future, if you're in a highly heat vulnerable area, the guidelines would not compel you to do one design strategy. They wouldn't say, all right, everyone's gonna do one thing and we'll have solved the problem. All of these projects are going to have their own needs, they're going to be their own snowflakes, as we heard before. And so we want to give a suite of options that designers can take to reduce that risk. So you can see things like improving the solar reflectance, adding vegetation, upsizing or improving the efficiency of your HVAC, and adding different energy recovery measures or renewable energy might all work to help you try to reduce that risk based on the scope at hand. And so the guidance document can be flexible to these different needs of different types of projects and allow these informed decisions to make sure that that investment is going to last its entire useful life. And I think that kind of leads to this next key component when we're speaking on climate change is the projects that we are designing now may last, depending on the type of asset, another 80 years, another 100 years. And the climate at the end of that useful life of the asset is going to be different than today. But we also have projects that have much shorter useful lives, like a replacement of an HVAC system, and we don't want to be over-designing those types of assets and therefore going against some of our decarbonization or efficiency goals. So we try to add that flexibility into the guidelines as well when we're thinking about the range of climate conditions that this asset could experience by considering the useful life of the individual components of the project. So we have some different climate criteria if you're designing for something much shorter versus if you're designing for a much longer time, trying to make sure that we're keeping all of our goals in top of mind. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about where the city currently is in rolling this out because we're at a really exciting stage. Local Law 41 was passed in 2021 that establishes a 5-year pilot program to incorporate climate resilient design standards on all city capital work. You can see here some of the purposes of the program and the ways in which that we're approaching it for city capital projects, but perhaps a little bit more helpful is looking at this graphically. So there are 2 components to the local law, and we are right in the thick of the part on the left here. So we are in the middle of the 5-year pilot. We're working across 23 to 26 different city agencies with 40 projects in the program now. And we are getting in the weeds with how this is going to work. We're talking to our agency partners, we're talking with their design teams, and we're pulling out data to showcase how resilient design can be incorporated, are there cost implications, what are the benefits of working this way, and how do we make sure the guidance document itself is in good shape for an eventual rollout. In parallel, we are designing a resiliency scoring metric, which is going to be the compliance mechanism for the local law. And this will require that at the end of this pilot program that all city capital projects meet a minimum score that will then be the way that we can say, yes, you designed with the future in mind, and you've used the CRDG effectively. So this is I think, really exciting place for the city to be. I'll leave you guys before I turn it into the panel with a specific example to try to bring this home and make it a little more tangible. So this project that I'll give an example of is a building retrofit of a library in Queens. This is a project by Queens Public Library, managed by DDC, and has design support by Allied Works and Thornton Tomasetti. So this is the expansion and renovation of an existing branch. So we have this challenge of existing retrofits that we're trying to work within this resilient and efficient design as well. And the main climate exposures that we have at this site are increasing heat and increasing precipitation. We do that exposure screening at the very beginning so that we don't need to be designing for all climate hazards at once. This is a very inland site, so obviously we wouldn't be looking at coastal storms here. But this project had a lot of opportunity to incorporate both our sustainability and our resiliency goals. And just to give a couple of tangible examples, in the increasing heat section of the guidelines, we think about resiliency on a couple of different scales. Number one is on a citywide lens. How do we make sure that projects are being a part of the solution to reduce the urban heat island effect? If every project that we build includes a green roof or a cool roof or a highly reflective or cool pavements, then in aggregate, that will eventually help towards reducing the urban heat island effect. So in our site design here, we're working to maximize the vegetated surfaces and using light-colored pavements. The second kind of component of heat-resilient design is on the building itself. How do we make sure that we have high-performance envelopes, that we are improving the air tightness, incorporating passive cooling if we can, and including climate-informed HVAC design standards. So we can see, like when we're talking about that HVAC again, we can design with these future temperatures in mind, and we can also design that the building itself can accommodate a bigger system if needed after this replacement cycle of the current asset. So in 2050, we don't need to pull out all the ductwork again. We can think about this now and make slight investments now in order to make sure that we're lasting as long as needed. And incorporating renewable energy and backup power as a way to be more resilient in these potential blackout events. We're also doing a community cooling center here, so thinking about the design loads for that as well. For the increasing precipitation side of this coin, same type of idea. The site design itself, we're all doing the right thing. We're all incorporating green infrastructure. We're adding potential additional design capacity for our stormwater systems to accommodate those future bigger rainfall events. That means we're all working together to make the city more porous and more spongy. And then in the building design itself, we can think about this from a emergency response perspective. We think about that we had these larger rainstorms in the past year. How do we make sure that our critical equipment is elevated to the right level so that we don't have to replace after a potential rain event? Can we move things out of the basement in the first place so there's no risk of that water coming in and damaging critical systems? Designing for increasing precipitation in the way that we size the systems, and having backup power for these larger, maybe more emergency types of events are all ways that we can really marry the two of some of our resiliency and sustainability goals in the same suite of investments with just a couple of design tweaks. So I'll end there, really looking forward to the panel, and thanks for allowing me to get a little bit more in the weeds with you on this ERDG.
Great. So we have what I consider, can you guys hear me okay? Speak closer. Oh, there we go. I think we have an all-star cast here at the Super Women's Resiliency Panel. Just like to note that it is an all-star cast, starting with Fiona Cousins. Would you like to introduce yourself, Fiona?
So I am Fiona Cousins. I'm with Arup. My background in resilience really started in the way most people start. It came straight out of a disaster, Sandy in particular, and I was the co-chair of one of the Urban Green's Building Resilience Task Force workforces. Since then, I worked on the New York State 2100 Infrastructure Resilience Report and a few other things, including working towards building a building on Roosevelt Island right after Sandy, where we were thinking very hard about, well, what happens if the sea level rises? Because we're only about 6 feet above where it is right now. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time, 10 years now, thinking about resilience, and I think that we are still struggling a little bit with this question about what do we want to be resilient to? The climate change hazards are one thing, but there's social change, there's demographic change, there's infrastructural change, which in itself causes vulnerabilities. And then what do we want to happen when the worst happens, and to whom? And I think that framing the question in that way and thinking about it kind of really broadly is a really important part of thinking about resilience. That's me.
Thank you, Fiona. Brenda, introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brenda Dix. I work at ICF as a director in our climate planning group here in New York City. I've been there for 9 years. Prior to that, I worked in long-range planning for transportation with a background in civil engineering, and I had the opportunity 13 years ago at that job to start looking at this issue of resilience and doing a sea level rise vulnerability assessment. Since then, we've come a long ways. I've had the pleasure of working with some of the people on this stage and some of you in the audience. And I really look at what are the risks and vulnerabilities that face our infrastructure systems, whether they be our buildings, be our roads, be our electric grid, be our water treatment systems, any of those sorts of systems, and ask questions of how do we make them more resilient, how do we adapt them, by thinking about how do we change our processes, how do we update our planning process? How do we update our capital budgeting process? And how do we implement programs to then turn these into a reality? So that's me.
Great, thank you. So we're going to start a little bit, and I was hoping that Fiona would start here, but clearly others can jump in. So really, talking back to kind of the impetus for the panel, what are we seeing out there with electric buildings and resiliency?
So one of the things that we are hearing quite a lot about with electric buildings and resiliency is that making buildings electric makes them less resilient, and that may or may not be true, right? We live here in New York City where much of the heating comes through steam and other things which don't need much electricity, in order to be able to operate. But through most of the rest of the country, almost everything that may look like it's not an electric system actually is an electric system. So heat doesn't work without the pump that drives it. Most things don't work without the controls that make them happen. So although there is a sort of obvious thought that making a building electric makes it a little bit less resilient, it's not really the case that it's the making it electric that makes that happen, because there are so many uses in buildings that require electricity. They just don't look like it when you kind of zoom out to 3,000 feet away. So that's kind of the first piece. I think that there are things that do change about building resilience when you try to make them all electric, or when you start to make them all electric. And some of the consequences of that are to do with the grid itself. The electrification of the grid is a pretty big infrastructure project. She says, I'm stating it ever so slightly. It has, the decarbonization of everything that we're doing through electrification is actually a pretty major infrastructure change that we need to understand as well.
Sure. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yes. I think that I do think that there is a perception and something that we're working to mitigate is this perception that the resiliency and sustainability are at odds. And I think something that really excites me is the public solar commitments that we're making in New York and the ways in which that we can incorporate renewable energy in a way that also improves the resiliency of some of our homes and businesses. There's always going to be those larger, like the hospital systems that will need, of course, I couldn't run on that type of system. But we have a huge opportunity here to advance public solar as a way to improve not only the sustainability, but the resiliency of our homes and businesses as well.
So I'm going to come back in on that, because I think that you framed it as resilience and sustainability can be kind of seen as at odds. My life experience is that all of the sustainability people got put into the resilience team when a disaster happened, and this happens kind of in a widespread way across industry. And so there's a sort of smushing together of the two terms about resilience and sustainability that I think it doesn't necessarily serve us well. We have to separate them out a bit. I sometimes joke, because I can't think of a better way of putting it, that sustainability is planning for the long term as if nothing is going to change, and resilience is planning for the long term as if everything is going to go wrong tomorrow. And we have to somehow figure out how to sort of navigate the difference between those two things. The thing that they have in common is absolutely that they are about planning for the long term. The other thing that I think that they have in common in terms of the material of what we actually do is that many of the things that are reinforcing from a sustainability point of view are also reinforcing from a resilience point of view. So, for example, in buildings, if you want to make them resilient, you might make them have lower energy use peaks. So you might reduce their peak loads. You might think about where that power is coming from. You might start thinking about what happens if there is no power. Could you make them work? And many of the things that kind of are sort of foundational to sustainability, reducing the loads, doing more with less, are also foundational to making it easier to make things resilient. So I think you have to understand the difference, then you have to sort of understand what problem it is you're trying to solve, and then I think you can find the things between the two that are reinforcing, but we haven't served ourselves well necessarily by kind of using them interchangeably, which I think still happens a little bit.
Yeah, and I wanted Brenda and I have worked together many times on kind of resiliency planning and decarbonization planning. So I wanted to get your perspective when you look across sort of the municipalities and kind of the building space that you're working in, where are you seeing that kind of work, like that really aggressive carbon neutral work and the resiliency planning kind of coming together, and what does that look like?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it's happening here, which is exciting to see. And I think, talking about this really new, exciting opportunity to be doing this type of investment, both in decarbonization and resilience, and what does that look like when you pair them? How can you pair them? How do they work together? I think that's sort of the key question we want to be asking, building off of what Fiona and Erika just said. There's sort of three things that I want to talk about. First, we do see some win-win opportunities, exactly what you were just saying, right? We can look at the building envelope. We can ensure that as we're investing in making our buildings tighter, sealing them better, using cooler materials, increasing shading, putting on green roofs, which also help with flooding, as Erika talked about, all of these things are going to set up your building better so that if there is an outage, the temperature is going to remain more stable. During those extreme heat events, during those extreme cold snaps, people are going to be able to be more comfortable, safer, and avoid a lot of those potential human health impacts. Same with solar. That's a great example that Erika brought up, right? As we invest in that, if we set it up correctly, pair it with a battery investment to really emphasize that resilience benefits, people can still have access to those heating and cooling systems if there is an outage and make them safer and more resilient. The second thing I want to talk about is equity implications in all of this, right? That's a big part of it. We are talking about spending a lot of money. It takes money to do that. How are we making sure that's happening in an equitable manner? And I think there's two ways we can start to think about that, and I'm curious what my other panel members would say about it as well. One way we can think about it is we already have programs in place to go into low and moderate income customers' houses and help them do energy audits, right? Helping them think about how they can make their building move towards a decarbonized state. But we could also be providing resilience recommendations when we do those types of audits. Or at a minimum, we could be providing them with recommendations of where is the nearest cooling center they could go to during an outage? Where is there a resilience hub where they could get the resources that they need? And exactly on that point, we need to recognize that not every building will be resilient, that there are people in our cities, in our communities that need to have places to go when there are outages. So maybe that means we need to invest more in some buildings to create those microgrids, to create those resilience hubs so that people have a safe place to go. And the third thing I want to talk about is there's sometimes some tension here, right? Now, it's not all win-wins all the time. I think it's fair to acknowledge that. That as we invest a lot in decarbonization, it's super exciting, but all of that increased electrification is going to strain our grid if we're not planning for that and preparing for it. And when does it strain our grid the most? It strains it when it's really hot or when it's really cold, right? When you're most likely to have a power outage from those types of events is when people are most at risk to these types of events. And so how do we make sure that we are investing in the resilience of our buildings so that people remain safe, and also investing in the resilience of our grid and that energy system so that that system can also remain stable and reliable during these types of changes in weather, changes in our climate, extreme events?
Thanks. A lot to think about, and certainly thinking about the tensions that you brought up and some of the questions that are coming in, and would encourage folks to keep the questions coming. We'll turn to that in a minute. So given that the city, Erika, is piloting some of this work, as you're going through this design process, what does that look like from a design perspective? How does that become iterative? What kinds of decision making need to happen in order to get to that final design that kind of breaks through some of those tensions?
Yeah, so I think having been going through at least some of the pilot process and also having seen the guidelines themselves implemented on projects in my past career at DEP, it has to start from the very beginning. It has to be something that we're considering our future risk at the very start of this project, and that begins by understanding the exposure to climate risks. I think Fiona's point is well taken, that there are many types of risks, and the climate ones, I think, is one that does have a general like geographic mapping component. And so at least there's an initial stage where you can say, is my building going to flood today? Is it going to flood at the end of its useful life? Yes or no? Is it in a highly heat vulnerable area today and then in the future? Yes or no? And having that as a part of the business case development of your project, so you know at the get-go that these are just the intrinsic characteristics of the design of your structure, goes a long way to making sure that at the end of your process, then you come away with a building that is also going to be resilient, and that you've really done a thorough assessment of how to withstand a future climate. So having that be from the very beginning has been a key part of the success of, I think, this program. And then number two, it can be kind of a hearts and minds game as well. It's like this is a almost cultural change that I think we've seen in this industry of how to make sure that we're planning for these future events and that we're keeping efficiency top of mind. Having really clear expectations for the design team, using something like the climate resiliency design guidelines and some of the ways that we're seeing the building code improve, some of the zoning improvements that we heard earlier are in the works, just making it as seamless and as transparent as possible what we're actually trying to achieve, and unlocking the barriers that we may be seeing in design standards to be able to incorporate them. I think is just the more it's seamless and the more intrinsic it is to the project, the more successful that will be at the end.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other piece of it. So I think that the industry writ large has, as Fiona was talking about, and I lived this post Sandy as well. I was the sustainable design manager at the Port Authority. Chief engineer said to me, "You used to talk about flooding. Can you work on the Sandy program?" It's like, right on. Happy to do so. But I think that there is a responsibility as design professionals, and in particularly licensed professionals, to be really well educated about these risks. And I am continually surprised at how little awareness there is throughout the design community about simply just climate projections. What is the IPCC saying? What does it look like 2050, 2080, 2100? What's the latest science? You've got an industry of folks who can tell you very, very detailed information about equipment standards and airflow, et cetera, and yet have no awareness of climate risk. And I do think that we're going to start to see legal responsibility as licensed professionals to be 100% educated, up to speed, and advising your clients on this risk, similarly as you would do with a seismic risk or another type of risk. And I think that's going to happen really fast because you're going to have insurers that are already pulling out of large parts of the country. This is happening quickly, and I think that this industry really has a legal responsibility, which may not be proven out in courts now, but may be proven out in courts later, to be upfront about what these risks are and how they impact the expenditures and the investments of all portfolio owners and operators of buildings and infrastructure. So, I've been saying that a long time. I've heard Fiona say it for many years. I've heard other industry professionals, but I do think that there is a really big role here for this industry to play. But in order to get there, everybody's got to understand what these risks are and understand how to design with them and how to engineer with them. Otherwise, we aren't going to be in a place where we make these great decarbonization investments, huge investments, without them being, and they're going to not be as resilient as they could be. So I just wanted to add that to what needs to happen. I don't know if anybody has anything to add there.
I could only reinforce you by saying there is already case law that people are being taken to court for not considering design criteria correctly for these buildings. So it's already upon us.
Yeah.
we should be thinking about it as design professionals.
And I will say that I do see it being taught more and more in school, in colleges, and I think that there's a lot of people coming out of those places that are excited about this topic. They are learning about it, and they want to bring that to bear. I think it is the larger culture change and shift in getting a broader audience to think this way, to pair that long-lived learned expertise with that enthusiasm and new awareness that's coming out of the younger, newer generations. And so it's an exciting time. I think we're headed in the right direction, but it's going to take a little bit longer.
But I think you point very clearly at a problem there, right? The people coming out of school in some ways are educated towards this, and the people who are running the projects are not necessarily. So I think there's not only a professional responsibility to understand what the future design criteria are, but it's also a future responsibility, a design responsibility to make sure that you're actually solving the problem that you should be solving, which may be about continuing education and remaining aware, because it's really difficult to kind of remain on top of what are all of the future challenges, what are the things that are changing, and this climate change moment is, I think, bringing it home for all of us in that the period of change is so rapid, right? A week ago we didn't think that wildfire risk was something we needed to worry about in New York City. 12 years ago we didn't think that flooding risk was something we had to worry about in New York City. We're forever kind of seeing these changes coming pretty at us pretty fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think along those lines of continuing education, right, it's also the shift from more deterministic design and planning to something that is more flexible, using that guideline type approach, looking at a larger suite, and being more performance-based.
Yeah, it's a different, the goal keeps shifting on us. As opposed to decarbonization, we have an end date and a greenhouse gas reduction goal, but resiliency and climate change just changes over time. So we have a lot of questions, just to pivot here. How do thermal energy networks play into this as a solution? So looking, and I think it's an interesting question to talk about because, we talk about the electrification of heat, but that doesn't necessarily mean air source heat pumps in every building, right? Or even site-specific geothermal. It could mean shifts in whole systems of how we're thinking about that. So anybody have any thoughts there?
We've done some work where we have looked at sort of microgrids and energy districts where you might think about, and it could be in New York City, perhaps in a real microcosm. It's like if you put residential together with commercial, together with other uses, you end up having a building or a group of uses where the peaks in both electrical use, energy use, occupancy, need for comfort don't align with each other. And don't align with each other is kind of important in this sense because it means you can build something small and then share the heat that's generated or the electricity that's generated between the different uses over a period of time. So there's an enormous promise in this that you can build less infrastructure and get more out of it by making sure that you're serving a variety of uses over a geographic area. The question to me is a little bit, how big is that geographic area and how difficult is it to set up those networks? So I think in the case of New York City, in a single building, you can see that you might be able to do some not especially clever math and show that mixed-use buildings could end up with smaller equipment that might end up with something that looks very good from an electrical standpoint and from a heat sharing standpoint and maybe even from a cooling sharing standpoint, and that kind of makes some sense. And of course there is inherent in a thermal network that you end up with some storage because if you have excess electricity you can make heat or you can make cool and then you can save it for when you actually need it because it's easier to save that than it's a sort of battery system. I think that where the challenges of that kind of approach come in is when you want to go to more than one building because you end up with boundaries of control. I think universities can do this pretty well, campuses can maybe do this pretty well, hospitals and large kind of developments can do this pretty well because they have control over the whole thing within the boundary. But I think it becomes really difficult on a sort of set of independent buildings sitting on a block to even think about doing that. And if you go further than a block, then you start losing on the amount of infrastructure that you have to put in order to connect these things together. And that used to be important when we were only thinking about emissions, but it's even more important now that we're thinking about embodied carbon for that infrastructure as well.
So I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about thermal networks. I think we covered that.
Fiona's pretty good.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you, Fiona. So I think there's a bunch of different questions about really how do we build, and since we're in New York State talking about zero emissions new buildings and in the city local law 154, how do we build a resilient electric building in general? And what are sort of some combinations of solutions that are out there that we're seeing that can work locally?
I think some tangible examples that we're seeing are on, leading with efficiency and having some of the things that we were talking about, pairing on the envelope, on the sizing of the systems, on the fuel source, can really have these very clear overlap between the sustainability and the resiliency goals. So I think just starting with like the base design of the structure itself, just adding in that resiliency layer of like the future projections that we're starting to see, maybe adding a little extra insulation, maybe adding a little bit more of that, like the HVAC considerations for that future temperature, adding maybe a larger size backup power or a solar and storage paired component. I think that's something that we're starting to see a lot. And then I think pairing that with when you're installing these decarbonization or these like energy efficient technologies, are those assets themselves at risk for a potential climate impact? So if you have a new utility conduit entering your building, is that conduit entry point at a elevation that could then potentially be a conduit for floodwater to enter? Do you need to elevate that by several feet if possible? Is the actual electrical equipment elevated or on pads or outside of the basement, as we were saying before, in an area that's going to be safe from a more extreme event? So I think it's both in the selection of the types of technology itself, and then in protecting that so it's able to operate and under these new conditions, is I think a kind of both the chronic changing of conditions and then that emergency response that we have to keep top of mind when we're thinking about resilient design.
So I would echo that. I think you start with the things that is like sustainability. You reduce the loads, you improve energy efficiency, you electrify the building. And then once you've electrified, you then have to figure out, how do I make it grid responsive? How do I add some storage? And how do I then sort of figure out what that actually means for resilience? The extra layer I would add is that depending on the building use, you need different things to happen in case of a disaster. Mm-hmm. So if you are an office building and it's a hurricane, you can send everybody home. You don't necessarily need to do anything very much. You just need to ride out the storm and make sure that you haven't flooded and you can turn yourself back on again the day after. But if you're in a house, you actually have a completely different thing because you've got people, where did you send all those people from the office to? You sent them all home. So it had better be good at home. So you're asking for a different thing. It's shelter in place with people in that location. How do you actually make that then work and make sure that not only have you got the minimum requirements, which may be okay for an hour or two, but then how do you come back and make sure that you're supporting all of the things like sanitation, shelter, cooking, in the 24 hours or so that the event might actually last. So I think there's this, coming back to this, there's resilience and what happens to the asset, and there's resilience, what happens to the people. And I think that sharpens up the design criteria for what you want to happen in an event.
I just want to also, I think, leading into some of the equity implications that Brenda also brought up. When we're thinking about like what it does mean to be safe at home, there's two things that the city has announced during Plan YC of incorporation and expanding heat pumps in NYCHA facilities, as well as HPD, the Housing Preservation Development Design Guidance for all of their new affordable housing, also consider these resiliency and sustainability targets. And these are really challenging investments that the city's making. It has a lot of partnerships and a lot of the requirements for leasing entities to also follow. So this is a really huge, I think, direction and a really huge commitment that the city's making to make sure that affordable housing and our most vulnerable residents are also, coming with us when we're going into this like decarbonized and resilient future. So just wanted to make sure that we are thinking about that when we're talking about this topic as well.
Yeah, and that was going to be kind of the next question, and there is some questions from the audience around, how do we maintain resiliency within a community, right? What does the building need? How do buildings need to be responsive to communities, and then vice versa? How are we bringing in community input? And I think that's sort of a question for the design guidelines specifically, but how are we working with communities in order to increase their resilience through that built environment?
Definitely. So I think when we are working to incorporate environmental justice, it works on several different scales. One of them is the way in which we prioritize projects as a city. So we've worked a lot with the state on the disadvantaged communities criteria and making sure that the investments that we're making are going to areas that have been historically disinvested in because of a long legacy of racist policies that we've had in New York City. We are working now to make sure that we are prioritizing some of this new funding is going straight to those who need it most. And I think that kind of takes this first step of making sure that we're putting that first and foremost when we have this new funding coming down. The second, I think, is at this building scale level. And this, I think, comes into play when we're talking about community input. I think about this a lot with the flooding work that the city's doing and some of the ways in which we're incorporating flood resilience into building design. There's a lot of things you can do with projections. You can look at maps, you can do future modeling, but you have a whole group of local experts that can tell you, I can't park my car here anymore because of the flooding conditions, or this is where it always ponds in this neighborhood after a rain event and it sticks around for this long. And so hearing from the community that you're serving and the users of whatever public investment or infrastructure project on what is the definition of success and what would be the ways in which this would be truly resilient. What are you using this space for? How do we make sure that we are considering the users of the space, thinking about a community center or something, really is, I think, essential to making a truly resilient project. It's one thing to have, the right HVAC criteria. It's another thing to make sure that folks know that there's a cooling center in their neighborhood that they can go to that will be operating during these bigger events and that they can tell their neighbors about it and have a safe place to go. So encouraging that community resilience, making sure that we're being really transparent with the way that we're designing projects and that we're inviting community into the design process, something that we can always do better as a city and something that we really try to encourage through the design guidelines process.
Yeah, and one thing that I just wanted to add is that Erika's spot on about, there needs to be that communication, there needs to be that collaboration, there needs to be that understanding. But it's also important to remember that when we're investing in resilience, like when we're investing in so many things, there's the potential for increased gentrification, right? We increase street shading in order to bring down the temperature in a particular neighborhood, which can drive up your rents, which can push people out. And so making sure that that community is part of those conversations, right? That these solutions are both what they want, as well as we're putting in place the policies and other mechanisms and measures to ensure that they'll be able to then be there to take advantage of those more resilient systems.
So I think there's a very straightforward model of how things work that is sort of useful in my mind to think about resilience. And on one side of it, you've got kind of ecosystem services, right? Or here's the natural world, and over here you've got human well-being. And the three things that connect them together are infrastructure and information and institutions. And it's a really simplified model. And we, because we're at a conference about buildings, are talking a lot about the infrastructure part of this, and actually the institutions and the information part of this prove actually to be very important to the resilience of the connection between ecosystem services and well-being. And I think that actually the institutions and the information pieces are the two places where you have to really work hard on the social equity issues. There are, of course, things that you can do in the built infrastructure, but it's how you operate them, the way in which you operate them, the things that you want to get out of them are much more a kind of institutional and information background piece. So the city, of course, is a part of the institution. There's all sorts of governance. There are community groups. There are ways of sharing information. But I think that we're sort of incomplete. Buildings can't do everything. Much as I would like to think that buildings can do everything, and engineers, architects, and planners can solve all of the problems of the world. In fact, there are a whole group of other people who need to be involved in this as well, because if the institutions aren't right and the information sharing isn't right, then we haven't solved the issues that we need to in order to actually bring resilience.
All great points. We're gonna have one more question from the audience, and thanks everybody for all the questions. So, knowing that this is not code, right? This is resiliency. Other than New York City doing, with their own projects, making it mandatory after the pilot. How do you value it to a client? How do you make sure that there are enough benefits incorporated that you can make a financial case, that you can show the value? There's a bunch of questions about that, and I'll layer on, are there opportunities for funding that may not be obvious, right? I mean, I know there is a small grant through HUD as part of the IRA money that is specific to resiliency, but maybe there are other ideas out there.
So I'm going to start by saying clients are humans, and humans tend to devalue the future. It's just one of those things we do. It's like we tend to forget the worst and imagine that everything's going to be okay. So we are always climbing this hill about how do you justify spending a little bit more money or doing a little bit more for things that may not happen until 2080. And it's a really difficult argument to make, because there are clients who will say, well, if I get the return out of it by 2050, I'm all good, right? I've made my pro forma, everything is going to be fine. I think also, and this applies to some of the sustainability work, if you are having a conversation that is entirely about cost, you have already lost. And so you need to start somewhere else. So it's what are the co-benefits, other benefits, immediate benefits, design criteria, problems that you are trying to solve that are embedded or interlinked with the resilience that you're trying to achieve. So we heard a little bit in the panel before about making public space as part of an office to residential conversion, dealing with the public realm. That doesn't necessarily have a hard payback, and it may have a hard payback, but to somebody who's not paying for it. That question about what are all of the criteria, what's the complete problem that you're trying to solve, what are all the other pieces? And I think it's really difficult to do, because if somebody is very commercially oriented and you're saying, well, what about all these other wonderful things that you might get out of it? You don't necessarily get very far in that conversation, but there is this question, what are all the other wonderful things that you might get out of it, and which of those things are important? Is it about brand? Is it about market positioning? Is it about something else that don't necessarily have that hard payback, but absolutely have that upfront kind of, yes, that's the stuff that I want to build, that's the way I want to solve my problem, these are the things that I'm interested in being connected to.
I think that's 100% correct. You need to look at the broader benefits. I think people do want to focus on the financial as much as we say that. And I think one particular part that you can poke at a little bit is the fact that insurance rates are catching up to these risks, right? They're starting to be more aware of it. They're starting to build those in. They're starting to escalate because of how regularly we're seeing these types of events. And I think that's at least one point that you can lean on a little bit when talking about the financial value of investing in resilience.
Also, just a little forecasting, I guess. Some of the, these are not mandated yet for projects that are not city work. So the guidelines will come online 2027, will be mandated for city projects. In Plan YC, though, we do have initiatives where we're working to, again, advance zoning and building codes so that we are taking better account of these climate risks. DCP did an incredible job with their zoning for coastal flood resilience, and they're starting to think about what that would look like from a stormwater perspective as well. Same thing with building code. We have Appendix G. We're working with them really actively to incorporate future flood risk into that work as well, and we are going to see that same trend in the stormwater space going forward. So it might not be a full requirement now, but thinking forward, I think we will be needing to justify why we wouldn't be considering the full useful life of an investment, and just really that being the really smart way to design for the future. So I hope that we're getting that way together.
Thanks, Erika. Great last words. We are out of time. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Susanne.
Don't go anywhere yet. We have a few announcements and then some closing remarks. We'll just give them a second to take a quick pic. Thank you, Susanne, and thank you to all of our panelists. It was a great way to end our conference. So first, there we go. First up, there is a QR code in the very back of your program on the last page here. This is to a short survey. If you can take that as soon as you can, we really value your feedback, and it's really important for our future programming. Also, we will be sending a recording out to all of these sessions so you can share them with your colleagues and anyone else who missed today's conference. And last, we will email everyone a certificate of completion that confirms 3.5 continuing education units. So if you are an AIA member and you submitted your AIA number to us at registration, we will report those credits on your behalf. If you're pursuing GBCI credits or PDHs, or you're a New York State registered architect, you can use the certificate to self-report those credits. And everyone will get a certificate whether you asked for CEUs or not. So with that, I'll hand it back over to John.
Colleen, thank you very much. Let's give a hand to Colleen for being our great MC today. All right, I'm down to my last card, which means we're at the end of the conference. Big announcement. We had 336 people attend today, which is our largest ever conference. So thank you. Thank you to all of you for doing that. I love the insights, and I hope you did too. I know I certainly learned a lot. So to continue the conversation that we've started today, I invite all of you to our summer member reception, which is on June 21st at the beautiful rooftop gardens of Cook Fox. So if you haven't been there, it's a fabulous office, fabulous venue, great place to network and interact and continue the conversation that we're starting today. I'm grateful to all of the speakers who've done a terrific job today, all the moderators, and of course to all of you for attending. So for the very, very final word and to close us out, please welcome Sabrina Canner, who is the Executive Vice President at Brookfield Properties and the awesomest chair of the Urban Green Board of Directors. Sabrina.
Good afternoon. As you heard, I'm Sabrina Canner of Brookfield and Chairman of the Urban Green Board of Directors. We've come to the end of what I hope you have found to be a very valuable afternoon. The trends we discussed today will no doubt shape the future of buildings here in New York City and beyond, which is why we're so grateful for your participation and your contributions to this very important dialogue. I want to take a moment to thank the many who made today possible. First, to our panelists and moderators for sharing their insights. Then to our sponsors, Carrier and Equinor, for their generous support. To NYU again for hosting us. Thank you, Cecil. And then to all of you for spending your afternoon with us at Urban Green. And finally, to Anushka, Ellen, Jack, and Sheena on the Urban Green staff for their hard work in producing today's conference. Awesome job. Thank you. I know I'm leaving with a sense of optimism. I hope you are as well. Yes, the challenges are tough, and the impacts of climate change are coming at us faster and faster. But the solutions are very doable, as we've learned today. And it's exactly that practical approach that will continue to guide the very important work of Urban Green. So thank you once again for joining us today. Enjoy your evening.